Welcome to Selling Circular, the podcast dedicated to exploring the innovative minds and ideas shaping our transition to a circular economy. I'm Sabira Lakhani, VP of Product at Reaply.
And I'm Garr Punnett, CEO of LoopLayer. In today's episode, we're taking a journey through the evolving landscape of circular economy solutions with a leader who's been at the forefront of this transformation. If you've ever wondered how your favorite outdoor gear gets a second life, or how sustainability can actually become profitable, well, you're in for a treat today.
Our conversation features Peter Whitcomb, CEO of Tersys, whose career trajectory tells a fascinating story of purpose-driven transformation. Peter began his professional journey in the banking world, one that I almost risked my career on.
Same as well.
Witnessing firsthand the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And when he experienced this front row seat to economic volatility, it sparked a profound career pivot, eventually leading him through Amazon's outdoor division to REI, where he developed innovative circular business models. And later, he was in leadership roles at Trove and now Tersus. What makes this conversation particularly fascinating is that Peter's current work at Tersus, where they developed proprietary waterless cleaning technology using CO2 instead of water, is a breakthrough innovation with applications far beyond clothing care.
I think this is what I was geeking out most about this company, is the use of this technology. So the liquid CO2 process is a fascinating cleaning process that allows essentially for more precision in cleaning and really dealing with complex either shapes or fabrics and surfaces. And so it offers a lot of advantages over, I'm going to use my big term here, aqueous solutions or other solvent-based methods. So just really what that means is any water-based methods or other solvents. So these older techniques often leave contaminants in water trapped in these surfaces or on these fabrics and fibers, which can be difficult to remove. So in contrast, liquid CO2 has a low viscosity, which allows it to penetrate tiny crevices and surfaces much more easily, leaving no residue behind. And so by maintaining that CO2 under a liquid state of pressure, it allows, again, much more intricate cleaning of items. And after cleaning, any CO2 just evaporates when it actually is released from that pressure, leaving the components dry and spotless. So this process is environmentally friendly because it's ultimately utilizing a closed loop system internal to this pressurized, essentially chamber system of washing machines. And so that's what recaptures and reuses the CO2 for continuous cleaning cycles. So geeking out about that. Ultimately, this CO2 delivers exceptional results while minimizing waste and making that cleaning process all the more less impactful on the environment and more an efficient solution for precision cleaning at scale.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
The company itself operates across three distinct business lines. The first, enabling resale programs for major brands like North Face and Lululemon. The second, providing critical cleaning technology for firefighter gear that removes over 98% of carcinogens, compared with just the 55% of traditional water cleaning. And third, a specialized down recycling operation that extracts, processes, and materials from post-consumer goods.
Yeah, and so ultimately that's all about, that they were using to clean the feathers within down cycling so that you didn't have to dry the feathers. I mean, this changes the way that you can deal with those materials. And they ultimately actually, I don't know if it was co-invented but they definitely pioneered that process in conjunction with Patagonia. So it was that type of collaboration that allowed that to happen, which I was absolutely geeking out about again. So throughout this conversation, we explore the tension too between different funding approaches in sustainability and contrasting that venture-backed model with other financially potentially more sustainable long-term approaches of business health.
So whether you're a circular economy enthusiast, a business leader curious about sustainable models, or you're interested in how your favorite outdoor brands are rethinking their relationship with consumers and products, this episode delivers some real practical wisdom from somebody who's shaped the industry from multiple angles.
It's really fun. Now, unfortunately, what we have to say here is, Sabira, you weren't able to join us for this one.
I was sad.
Yeah, we couldn't make the timing work with you being in India still. So you will hear me just doing the interview, unfortunately. But it was nonetheless great to talk to him, great to dive into some subjects. And before we dive into that, let's first get a little bit more about our first selling circular partner, Circularity 25, presented by Trellis Group.
Hey, Circular Squad, we're teaming up with our friends at Trellis Group to bring you the inside scoop on the hottest event in circular economy, Circularity 2025 in Denver.
If you're getting CES vibes, think about that, except instead of the Consumer Electronics Show, we've actually got 3 days of circular economy solutions. It's why we love circularity, not just because it's the preeminent proving ground for circular economy breakthroughs, but also it's because where we actually meet many of our podcast guests for the first time, and they actually end up becoming friends.
Which we love. So from April 29th to May 1st, Colorado Convention Center is going to be buzzing with innovators, policy movers and shakers, and circularity changemakers. And if you're there in person or online, our partnership with the Trellis Group has got you covered. So when you join in person, you're going to have inspiring keynotes, actionable workshops, and the ability to share great meals with industry colleagues. And then, of course, you can take those learnings back to your team. And if you're joining online, we've also partnered with Circularity to bring you live inside content from the conference.
You get to see Sabira behind the scenes, working the interviews. So
Love
use
it.
code C25podcast at registration for 15% off passes. But hurry, because again, as the conference gets closer, the prices go up. So grab your reusable coffee cup, rally that team, because we're all about building this future together, one reclaimed polymer / one circular partnership at a time.
See you in Denver.
I will start off there with is tell me a little bit about your career start in banking and finance. And I loved seeing that in sort of your portfolio, your profile there of working maybe traditional banking finance, and then there's a career shift, and then you go on a whole different new trajectory.
Yeah, I did the I guess what you'd call the hard pivot in the
Yep.
career. And there were a few variables that drove that, and I'm incredibly grateful for kind of that foundation in finance. It served me well in multiple capacities in kind of the retail, physical, and now circular world. And I think there are sort of two key moments that drove that shift. One was I was at a company called AllianceBernstein, which was a buy-side asset manager. We were one of the largest asset management shops in the world, actually going into the financial crisis. Almost had $1 trillion under management. And we were also the largest shareholder of all major kind of financials that went belly up in 2008, 2009. Fannie, Freddie, AIG, Lehman Brothers, you kind of name it. Our CEO at the time is a famous value investor, and he had sort of a contrarian thesis on the financial sector in the face of what was becoming more and more evidently sort of a crisis. And so in a matter of about 9 months, assets under management went from nearly $1 trillion to just over $500 billion. And so we were sort of case study A of the fallout on kind of Wall Street, so to speak. I was in a very junior position, so I was somewhat inoculated, but I got a sort of front row seat to this whole thing. Mass layoffs, people throwing things through windows, just kind of total chaos. And that, seeing that we were managing retirement plans for, at the time, there was still a fair number of pension plans with large sort of enterprise institutions. So GM, Boeing, 3M still had sort of these legacy pension plans, but there was a shift underway, of course, to more 401k, what you call defined contribution plans. And, seeing sort of the evisceration of value and where millions and millions of people were sort of dependent on, us being successful to retire, us and, legions of other sort of financial managers sort of instilled in me the impermanence of that industry in some ways. And then also the sort of transience. And so, we were selling, by the time I left AllianceBernstein, I was in our alternatives group, which was selling sort of non-traditional stocks and bonds. So hedge funds. We had a few different private equity offerings. We had a macro global hedge fund. We had a long short fund. And at some point in that role, my boss handed me a book and said, pursue something where there's sort of something more tangible and understandable. And he handed me a book that was called the Hedge Fund Hedge. And he's basically like, put all your money in the S&P, go build something like real and solve some like real problems. So I
love that.
yeah, I went back to school, and I had that sort of stuck in my head. And I grew up largely in the mountains, and I had this sort of, maybe a bit idealistic in my late 20s, early 30s, was like, oh, I'm going to go work in the outdoor industry and kind of marry passion with what I'm doing. And that, of all things, propelled me into Amazon, where I got an offer, and I was like, hey, I really want to be on the outdoor team. And this is my way into this space. I can kind of get exposure to e-commerce and retail and all these interesting outdoor brands. And we have a really big sort of footprint
And kind of hitting their stride, like right as
yeah,
e-commerce is really
yes.
going. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Good call out. Yeah, I mean, that was 2012,
Yeah.
through kind of 16. And I mean, it was a really interesting moment. I wish I held on to more stock, but you live, you learn. But that was sort of the landing point, but the catalyst for me to get to where I am now, because I initially was a buyer for the bike category, and then I took on a broader role, kind of as a GM of more kind of the outdoor business, overseeing supply chain and merchandising, vendor management, marketing, etc. And a couple years in, it felt like we were just contributing to this sort of massive virtual, in my world it's virtual, but these were physical things, a landfill that I couldn't see. And I was like, there were an increasing number of Chinese-based sellers, even the sort of premium brands, quote unquote, that we're working with, were sort of moving down market and creating more sort of transactional items. And I was incentivized just to list as much stuff as I could possibly find in the world. And I was like, this is sort of counter to how I engaged in the outdoor, which was like less, better things that sort of are durable. Still had, my father's camp gear, his
Right.
cook set and his sleeping bag. I'm like, these things still work. And so I ended up at REI, and then I don't know if you're interested, can kind of get
Absolutely interested. Yeah, we can kind of keep that. Yeah, I mean that kind of does follow into the next question, which is like that is clearly an ethos change, and you're sort of pursuing that. This takes us into REI. This takes us into Trove. This sort of hits on that note of reuse. I'm guessing this starts to hit really at REI.
Yeah, it did. And I hadn't that hadn't been a sort of earnest thought where I was like, oh, I need to think about transforming consumption models at Amazon. It was more like, hey, this doesn't really feel right. And it's not, there's a lot to love about Amazon. There's not a lot of negative I could say about sort of the business itself and what they're building, and it's incredibly impactful. There was just sort of, that ethos misalignment. For me personally, in REI, I came into a strategy role and was fortunate to work under our CEO at the time was named Jerry Stritsky, and he, visionary leader, kind of classic big idea, kind of pushing the organization, pushing sort of high potential individuals. And there were many. The team was fantastic at the time. I was sort of, this emerging person on the strategy team, didn't totally know where I was going to land, and got tasked with go figure out this circularity thing. Jerry specifically was like, I really, really think rentals are our future. As you look at sort of the durability of our categories we carry, how the consumer engages with us, and it's an interesting on-ramp to the co-op where we're our customer, our core member, because it's a co-op model, is aging out. They're on average more white, they're more male. All the things sort of, they were an existential threat to them.
Yep.
In sort of multiple dimensions. And he was like, Peter, go figure out this kind of rental resale thing. And so I did that from the strategy office and built sort of a business case, and what it was, I think, strong enough to at least go kind of test into it. And then that evolved into, hey, this is working, resale and rentals. And by the way, kind of take new concepts that may fall under the circularity umbrella, like sort of what we call these activity centers, and go scale it.
In that moment of both you being tasked with pursuing a newish model, if not straight new model, and then the internal conversations. I mean, was this really visionary led, saying, hey, we need to do this? What were those internal discussions like when starting that program, or really trying to think through, how does this work?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. There was a great appetite at the time because partially the co-op had a nice tailwind, but we recognized kind of the threat of both down markets, so kind of big box and mass retail like Amazon and Walmart and Sierra. And then at the time, Backcountry was doing interesting things. Moose Jaw was still around. And so there was an understanding that, hey, we need to diversify how we engage with our customer. And circular models are resonate from an impact perspective. They resonate from a price point perspective. And so there was actually a fair amount of early intent around pursuing this as I kind of moved and my team moved into earnestly building and sort of pulling resources from the core. It got a lot harder. You've probably lived through this to some degree.
It gets real.
It gets real. Yeah, it got real fast. I probably made more mistakes than had successes. On net, the resale business far and away was the most successful. Rentals was incredibly hard. And I don't know if you want to kind of go down that tributary, but just from sort of a commercial model perspective, an ops perspective, rentals was hard. And the anecdote I'll give you is, by the time I left, I had a team of about 80 people, and over 80% of those people were devoted to rentals, and the balance was devoted to resale and activity centers. And so you could sort of see this imbalance of complexity. But, that was my sort of aha couple years where I was like, you know what, this model where you're sort of disaggregating potential growth of this retailer from sort of, resource extraction while also delivering a viable economic model. And I'm coming from this from like a finance and strategy.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I didn't come into it from, impact or sustainability. And I partnered with those teams really closely, but that, was like, okay, I need to go do this. Like, this is interesting. I think this can kind of have an impact beyond REI, and that propelled me into Trove.
What a nice segue. When it comes to Trove, I mean, you're clearly, I think what I'm curious about on the rental side of REI, I mean, are we starting to see services that are needed to upkeep and keep things within sort of an operational condition for clients, for the customer? Is that sort of taking that experience now and saying, oh, wow, there's a lot of partnerships needed, and maybe we don't need, I guess what I'm asking is, what's the identity shift where you're saying, okay, this is interesting from a retailing capacity. Now, what about from the other side with Trove, where we're now engaging in services to help these brands? What's that conversion look like for you, both you to say, oh, this is what's needed, I understand this mission at Trove, and then apply this? And if you can't see where this is going, audience and Peter, there's another conversion happening where with Tersys just around the corner.
Yeah. That there's a lot to unpack in that question, and you've thought about this a lot, clearly.
Yes.
For this space. These are really good questions. Can I bring you onto my team?
Yeah, absolutely. I dream this stuff now. At this point, it's it's so consuming. Yeah,
I love it. I absolutely love it. I mean, I think so. And Andy Rubin, founder of Trove, we had partnered with Trove at REI. So I was, as you commented, I was, had the lens of kind of a Trove customer as a retailer, as a brand. And I think he was looking to bring someone in who could kind of speak that language and evangelize internally at Trove. Hey, here's what we kind of need to go build to meet this market as it's, emerging, still very nascent. And kind of, I would say, evangelize that across kind of multiple retail vectors. And the service land, the service provider side of things, very challenging in a B2B capacity, as you alluded to now, kind of running a B2B service provider. And if you don't have kind of early success and momentum, there's a whole litany of kind of challenges that sort of present itself. Trove was lucky to, have partnered very early on with Patagonia, their wornwear program, REI, what they call now Resupply. And so you had a couple of these anchor customers, beachheads that you can kind of build off of. But go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think what's hitting me in that moment is, and this is kind of going to be a harder pivot because I loved your term of anchor technology, anchor services, and anchor clients in that way. Hard pivot, audience. Sorry about this, but I'm uniquely sort of fascinated by circular models that have anchor technology to them. And to go into this hard pivot with Tersys, that's what is so interesting to me too about you all and what you're doing is it seems rooted in a foundational technology. And what you all have done over the past set of 5 to 10 years is maybe really just 5 years is really try to pivot into more services, but foundationally rooted in almost that vertical integration of the service that y'all are providing. And that seems then really kind of like a winning formula.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, I mean, so just to step back into
Please.
Trove, because that context into Tersus, I think, is really
Right.
important.
Yeah.
Trove, at the time, we were building software and doing the operations. And, frankly, and this was at this point, 2020, 2021, we were pretty good at both, but not great at either. And so we didn't quite, other than having anchor customers, we didn't have, to your point, sort of an anchor, hey, technology or differentiator.
Great.
Other
Yes.
than, hey, we are vertically integrated and you brand X, if you want to launch a resale channel, we have the end-to-end solution. Since then, Trove has evolved eons. They just focus on software. They're building tons of best-in-class, software and services around that. So is Archive. There's a couple kind of players who've emerged in the white label, resale
Management.
software side.
Yeah.
But there was this big gap in sort of best-in-class operations for circular programs, namely resale for brands and retailers. And I had the opportunity to join Tersys in 2021. And I'd be lying to you if I didn't say there were days at Trove where I was like, hey, we should buy Tersys.
Yeah.
And kind of embed them into what we're doing if we want to continue to do ops for the reasons you've identified. The two primary being, we have a proprietary sort of best in the world waterless cleaning technology that uses CO2 instead of water to clean textiles. And we have it's fully patented and proven to be more effective and more efficient than water across an array of textiles, sort of cleaning and decontamination applications. And then we have, since I've joined, and credit to our team, have built out the suite of services that allow us to be the best and most efficient touch of used product and find sort of an optimal and ideally high margin path for that thing.
That's I think what again, to reiterate, attracted me to Tersys, mostly because I see that's a space that I see for manufacturers that aren't as quick on the uptake of saying, hey, this is how we're actually going to differentiate ourselves, is going and investing in those services or going and doing that. Now I'm coming at that from the B2B landscape, not necessarily I shouldn't say B, large appliances or healthcare machinery or core components to automobiles, those types of where I see that as so interesting than what you all are providing, and it's such an interesting model in the apparel space. Is clearly going to be the future, is more vertical integration, or working with a vertically integrated service provider in that way. And so I think ultimately this leads into a question of, really, what does that mean in terms of, you all seem fairly unique that you can go into any type of situation, any type of sales conversation and say, hey, we can be your backbone. We can do the things that no one else wants to do, but provide you this excellent customer experience. Is it that easy now, walking into those types of conversations? This is maybe kind of leading. I know if it's never that easy.
Yeah. Listen, I think, there's a couple ways I can answer that. Of course, in a B2B landscape where you're working with premium brands, it's a very long sales cycle.
Yes.
And sort of beholden to their decision making. But I think to your point, we, of all the businesses and industries I've worked in, given, I would say obsession on being a solution, like we take solution very seriously. It's a very intentional part of our name. We have created a number, I think, of tailwinds and product market fit for us, for the business. And then the macro environment is kind of uniquely positioned to support what we're doing, whether from a consumer shift point of view, a regulatory environment point of view, an interest and sort of intrigue in like the physical world, very much like you are. We're in the business of keeping used textiles in use longer.
Yep.
That's simply what we do. And there's some that sort of three-dimensional world where everybody can understand that. Like, I understand what a used piece of clothing is, or a used North Face jacket is. And Tersus, you play a role in restoring that, whether you're repairing that or cleaning that or fulfilling it. I think there's a litany of sort of variables that have uniquely positioned us to say, hey, we're the best solution for you today. And there is an ease in that. Like nothing's easy kind of from my seat, but relative to what I know, we're very fortunate to kind of be able to have the customers we have and all those things I just described and say, we can absolutely tell you we're the best solution right now.
What I love in that is you have all of the ability to claim that in the context of walking into a meeting and going and talking to a brand. But how do you balance, and this is I'm very curious about, the behind the scenes nature of the service and solution that you're providing with how you build your own brand recognition in the space? And how do you balance? Like, really, just how do you balance that? I mean, is it that important to have consumers who know who you are, or is it really not? And really being able to be that behind the scenes actor.
Yeah, I would say so we have three lines of business, and it's important for me to kind of lay this context so I can answer the question properly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I commented on Steve Madsen. He's our founder. He's still part of the business, founder and CTO. He developed this waterless cleaning technology out of a dry cleaner he ran in Colorado, and kept the candle burning for many years to kind of get us in this position. And today we deploy that technology into three areas. One is resale enablement for big brands and retailers, which I think you generally understand, the audience will understand. The second is basically we lease the hardware or sell it into the firefighter and PPE industry to decontaminate hard to clean firefighter gear or firefighter gear and other PPE, where historically they've cleaned that gear with water. And at best, water can remove 55% of the carcinogens in the gear. Cancer is a major cause of death for firefighters, and it's often caused by their gear. And so our technology can remove over 98% of the PAHs and VOCs in their gear. So it's sort of this stepwise function change and sort of efficacy and how they care for their gear and themselves. It's very new and very exciting. And then lastly, just to touch on it, we have a down recycling business. So this vest I intentionally wore today because it's our recycled down. We take end of life, post-consumer, in some cases pre-consumer goods from brands, retailers, bedding companies, and extract the down and feathers, and we have a proprietary process to do that, and then we clean it in our CO2 technology and then sell it back to a Crescent Downworks or a wholesaler and get it back into the supply chain. And I don't know if you want me to, that's the context. I can come back on your question if you'd like.
Please do. Yeah. I mean, that's, again, what I love about you elaborating on all those models, again, is foundational to the success of how you can pursue the circular economy models.
Yeah. And they're, like you said, I mean, for a long time, we took a lot of pride in just truly being the backbone behind the curtain. You don't know who we are. All we're going to do is a better job, and that's going to kind of permeate everything else. And our best kind of salesperson is North Face and, Lululemon and Arc'teryx. And
reputational word of mouth. Yeah.
That has shifted a bit, because we do believe there's potential to tell this story in a more profound way. The technology, the potential reach of this technology is well beyond what we're doing today. Hey, can we kill dry cleaning as we know it? Can we displace all water wash everywhere as we know it today? In every kind of commercial application, industrial application, every apartment building, and kind of high density urban areas. So there, that story is undertold. And so I went from spending less than $5,000 a year on marketing to we now have a director of marketing, and we are well over the budget I didn't have this year, but believe that it's a good investment to kind of drive awareness both in a B2B sense, but to your point, Garr, also in a kind of B2B2C sense.
In that B2B2B or B2B2C sense, you are also now working with many brands that compete for the attention of customers. Something I deal with all the time on my end is balancing out when one particular brand says, hey, you're working with us and them. How do you balance that conversation? Because I think there's particularly learnings that you've gotten through many different iterations of your career to apply that nuance.
Oh man, it's this question, if I had sort of the panacea to it, I feel like I'd be retired.
Fair enough.
But it's something we are constantly thinking through and trying to balance. It's when you're B2B, you can't control what the brand does, and you can't control where they invest. You can't control how they message. What you can do is provide them data. You can provide them proof points. You can articulate sort of relativity of X versus Y. And I think our team's done a pretty good job of that. And I think first and foremost, we are a profit center for the brands we work with. And that's, at the end of the day, there's going to be a CFO who says, is there value in what we're doing here? And, often you're getting the marketing team support, always getting the kind of impact, sustainability, ESG team support. But you have to kind of get everybody's support. And so we've taken that, hey, we need to be like valuable in all these dimensions, and all of them need to be important approach.
Well, that's an interesting, I think where that takes me is I'm fascinated by this. There's this tension that exists in the industry, which is using circular economy and sustainability metrics as a market advantage to say, hey, look at, we're better than this other brand.
Yeah.
Is there a future where that becomes not as competitive? Where we really do embrace this and say, hey, this is just standard. We should all be doing this. And then what does that do to the industry? This is really future focused and sort of theoretical, but I'm fascinated by that competition aspect where brands are looking to you all to say, hey, you're making us better than them. Why are you still working with them?
Yeah, there is, in our space, in branded resale, it's a very competitive landscape on the software side. And outright kind of, maybe war might be too strong.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, but it's a heated space where we are given kind of our unique position. We like working with all the software platforms, as many as we can. And then ultimately, we do have a lot of confidence in our track record. And frankly, we talk to brands who are like, hey, we're not going to do it, or we're going to do some element of this in-house, or we're going to work with XYZ competitor. And we're like, great, we'll help you think through that. And we'll kind of be your partner on that journey, frankly. I had a conversation with a brand this week, a massive global kind of outdoor brand everybody knows, who went with another partner a few years ago, and we've stayed in touch, and we're friends at this point, and often kind of just giving perspective on things. And so I think there is that's a microcosm of, in our space, there has to be collaboration, there has to be learning, there will be winners and losers tied to just, at the end of the day, there's venture money going in here, who's going to survive, but can we take the best of the best and kind of consolidate that down? And that's, I think we're going to see a lot of in the next, I feel like I've been saying this for 6 or 7 years now, but there'll be continued consolidation here where it'll be clear for brands, here are your 1, 2, maybe 3 options versus 7 or 8.
Yeah. Where does that leave the investment landscape in this space? We keep seeing more and more, well, definitely on the software solution, we see more keeping the pop up, because there's kind of a run on the software side of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
But how do you, really with some foundational business acumen, how do you see this as sort of presenting in the future of competition? Not necessarily for Tersys, but just in the industry of just saying, is there more innovation, or does this consolidate and get stagnated in some way? How do you view that?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of sort of venture dollars or just kind
Could
of
be,
outside?
could be venture dollars, but more than anything, I mean, I think I'm fascinated by other industries that are going to follow apparel's model. I think apparel is almost that leading industry where people are
Yeah,
pointing fingers, being like, "Oh, maybe this could be applicable to us," and there's going to be
interesting.
this broadening of solutions and then again whittling of consolidation. And I think that's where I'm fascinated from like almost a macro business development
Yeah.
landscape of like how does that play out? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple paths right now. One is less optimistic, and I'll just paint that picture. Um, there's a little graveyard of companies who haven't made it, who've been venture backed, or who haven't like made it in the sense like, hey, hit scale,
Right.
true commercialization. I don't need to list those companies, but there's a few, and I'm seeing more. There's going to be more, and so that's never good. And so you go, okay, maybe, and my thesis, frankly, coming out of REI going into Trove was like, this isn't really a venture backable space. I think this is like private equity or family office. And Tersys is not venture backed. I mean, we have Patagonia, is involved, but otherwise, haven't taken venture. And part of that reason being sort of what we discussed earlier, brands are going to move at their pace. The consumer shift is happening, but it's not sort of this tectonic, everybody stop buying new stuff and just complete cut over to secondhand. But it is happening and it's really kind of methodical and it's sticky and so the other side of that coin of where, maybe failure and ventures like I'm not going to touch this at all anymore. I think back to my earlier comment, I think there are going to be 1, 2, 3 winners, and that is going to be kind of your beachhead for the next, whatever industry it is. And I actually think electronics is ahead of us.
Yes.
In many ways, there's many sort of established big platforms out there. Best
The
Buy has
iTad industry that sort of
yeah,
services. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And like, Best Buy has like a multi-$100 million P&L around open box returns and their take back program. And
That's a
that's
great
been
call
out
out.
for decades. And so, yeah, I mean, I do think, and that's the sort of irony of this whole space is like this concept of used of like, hey, eBay and Craigslist has been around a very, very long time. What we're enabling is kind of brands to do this in a more elevated.
I love that thought sort of on venture, not any sort of derogatory. I'm not trying to apply this of shorter term thinking. They're
Yeah.
looking for quicker returns. Again, I'm not as too familiar with the private equity sort of
Yeah.
horizon line, but if
Yeah.
there is something there where maybe this sustainability circular economy has played in the venture space. And what I hope maybe some will realize is the capital needs to be a longer term horizon line. And the shift in action needs to be that. That was always, for me, I felt an unsustainable pressure on a sustainability company when dealing with venture. And so that's what it's always fascinating, that type of relationship.
Felt it a lot of drives bad decision making, to your point, less sustainable decision making in every sense of that definition.
Right. Yeah. Finance. Yeah.
Yeah, I think having gone through when I was at Trove, we raised $100 million in 2 years, right? So we raised a lot of money. That's all public. Wouldn't do that again. I came to Tersys and I was like, what we're gonna do is, not raise money and leverage debt and build a business that we can support given our operating costs and structure. And a credit to Steve and our board for kind of having that discipline and instilling a lot of that in. Now we're profitable for 5 years running, and this I think it's a little more of the model that requires way more discipline and harder decisions. Like you don't get to go have the company offsite all the time, and you don't have to compromise culture and things like that. But you do. I'm like looking at early on. I was like, do we need that pencil? And that can we get literally everything used? And you can't always get the talent you want. Now we've kind of earned our way into, making some of those more I'd call luxury decisions.
Personally, I mean, you can speak whatever degree you're willing to be comfortable in this. That that's another ethos shift. That's another big one that I think takes somebody to go through that process of raising money, operating in that type of environment. What was that like? How comfortable or uncomfortable was that shift in terms of
Really, really hard. Probably harder than the industry shift and very necessary. When I came in, it was Steve and Jake Jackson were kind of the two running the business, and they had that culture, and so they kind of beat it over my head. And I had taken, I don't know how familiar you are with Amazon, but one of their leadership principles is frugality. Like I was part of it. Like literally my first desk was like looked like a door because that was their whole anecdote. And we're all crammed into this tiny room. And so I understood that. I understood how important that was. And then I, swung from an REI to a well-funded venture-backed company. And I think you also grow the most, right? In kind of those moments of friction. And I, just since it's a personal question, I love that. And I
yeah.
love that challenge. And I loved, and still do, thinking through how do we do more with less? And that kind of like, necessity is the mother of invention was like so true. And I have so many stories related to that when you're kind of like, oh, I make payroll this week or not.
Amen. I thank you for going there personally, because I think I've dealt with a lot of questions and folks reaching out in which they're sort of thinking about, is this industry still for me? How do I do this? And I think this is almost for many players in the industry a moment of friction where there's an evolution that is happening in terms of no, if you care, we might have to do this a little bit differently. And this isn't to say that we were wrong. This isn't to say that we've failed. It's that this solution set has not quite been done at what we're trying to do with it. And so circular economy is maybe going to have more and more of a reckoning, and sustainability will even have more and more of a reckoning in order to get to that next set of goals. So I think it's good for people to hear that a part of that is understanding maybe how to be frugal in these types of circumstances, and that the capital isn't always going to be flowing.
Yeah. Well said. Better than I could have said. That's spot on. I mean, it's now once you kind of break through or cross that chasm, it's we're now kind of hitting the scale where I'm like, oh, like we're having an impact. Like this is getting interesting and exciting. Yeah. So there is that sort of pot at the end of it that's. Or not at the end. I mean, I feel like it's day one, honestly.
Yes, but maybe there's an engine that can rev a little bit louder.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, what gives you the most hope as we round this out? I mean, as we look towards the landscape of these companies that are finding success, finding the friction in their success, and really trying to evolve, and as you think about Tersys and your own sort of evolution, what do you see? What gives you the most hope?
Yeah, I think building on that sort of last thread there, we all of our partners, and there's a little bit of a misunderstanding of branded resale, are, and I shouldn't say all, but the vast majority are growing. They're profitable and they're acquiring new customers. And it's challenging some of the paradigms of what I came from, which was this kind of linear model of, manufacture halfway across the world.
Right.
Based on historical demand, sell it once, never see it again. And, my thesis coming out of REI was like, hey, everybody can do this who makes great products. And, we're still scratching that surface, but we work with, a few dozen brands now, and we're proving the case. And so now we're moving into, as you just said, get a bigger, amplify the impact, hopefully be the beachhead for kind of the next industries that can kind of unlock this and find value in all the resources and the things that we already exist and have already been made.
And in that message, I love the domestic reshoring, the regionality, probably, which we never even really got to touch to. I'm sure you all have lots of data and thoughts on regions and how this stuff travels across the country. But what a great time. And I think that's what I'm most excited about in our industry is the tactileness of these solutions, and then what it can mean for communities.
Totally. I mean, kind of ironically, there's, there's a lot of tailwinds sort of with this administration right now for what we're trying to do for brands. And, there's also a lot of sort of countervailing forces there. But, in that sense, these business models are kind of recession proof. There's, a lot of sort of ways to make them successful. And it just requires creativity and infrastructure and the services and all the things we've discussed today.
Well, love it. And thank you for sharing a little bit of that knowledge. I feel like there's always more probably to discuss with Tersys, but we were scratching the surface and I think we got to some really good stuff already. Thanks for the time today.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome. Great to connect.